Hello, I'm Ned Foley, and I am honored to direct the program on election law at The Ohio State University. And I want to thank our panelists for another one in our series of conversations, as well as our audience. And if you've been with us before, you know that I'm immediately going to turn this over to my dear friend and colleague, our Deputy Director, Steve Huffner, who is going to moderate this conversation. And as before, it's going to be informal and a brainstorming session. So take it away, Steve.
Thanks, Ned. It's great to be doing this again. And also thanks to all of you who are with us. I'm not going to introduce you at this point. We'll do it as we get going here in just a minute. But I will just say at the outset that it's really been a privilege for us at Ohio State to be able to gather a group like this. We've got 12 people today. It's in some sense the fourth time we've done something like this during this election season, beginning late last spring, then again right before Election Day. We did a 5 days out, what does it look like? And then we did another event shortly after the unofficial results had indicated what the clear outcome of the presidential election would be. And now we are doing one at the end of the week in which the presidential electors have cast their respective votes throughout the country. And in each of these events, the assemblage has been a little different just depending on who was able to be with us. And we're really pleased that you are with us today. What we'd like to do to begin is just to ask each of those of you who are here as our panelists today to just spend about 60 seconds, if you can, to tell us what you are most thinking about at this point in the process. There are still plenty of things to talk about, whether it's from the standpoint of just what kinds of interesting procedural activity might yet occur on January 6th when Congress counts the presidential electors, to the ways in which various actors in this process continue to reflect on what's gone on, to thinking about what kinds of lessons we could learn going forward. So there are lots of things to talk about. So in 60 seconds or less, each of you just tell us what you're thinking about now, and then we'll open it up from there. And to structure the 60-second reflections from each of you, I'm just going to dive in the middle of the alphabet, starting with the M's. So that puts Lisa Mannheim up top. Lisa is a law professor at the University of Washington, and it's great to have you with us. Lisa, your thoughts.
Thanks, and thanks so much to the election law at Ohio State. This has really been a terrific collection of discussions that you all put together, so thanks so much. I guess right now I am really excited about not thinking in real time about the 2020 elections, but instead to looking ahead to future elections. And we're not there yet. We have runoffs. We have the January 6th count. That being said, 2022 is going to come around faster than we think it is. So when it comes to the upcoming elections, I think it's important not only to think about what substantive reforms would be helpful. I mean, there are a lot that would be helpful, but also to think about where do those reforms have to come from. And historically, a lot of election-related reform has, in a sense, come from the courts rather than from legislatures. But a number of developments this election cycle have helped to confirm, in my mind, that it's going to be really hard to get a lot of these reforms effectuated through the courts. And I don't mean the courts are necessarily going to strike them down. Instead, I mean the reforms are going to have to come from the legislatures, maybe from Congress, but in all likelihood from the state legislatures. And there's really quickly 3 reasons for that. One is that we have a changed federal judiciary. It's changed in ways that we don't yet understand what it's going to look like, given the number of appointments that we've seen in the last 4 years. And it's changed in ways that's likely to make it more resistant to certain types of rulings. We also have doctrinal developments coming out of this election cycle that, again, we don't exactly know what the implications are. On the one side, we have developments suggesting reduced federal court involvement in elections. This was happening before the 2020 elections. And then we also have this indication that the federal courts are likely to run with the independent state legislature doctrine. And that's, again, going to reduce the role, in a sense, that the state courts can play. And then the third thing is that, frankly, we are still in the tail end of this concerted effort to use the court system in a subversive way. And that's a big warning sign going forward. We can't keep having elections sort of be treated in the way that they've been treated this cycle. And so all of this combined makes me think that the courts are likely to play less of a role going forward than they have in the past.
Thank you, Lisa. So next up, I'll turn to Michael Morley, from a law professor as well from Florida State. Michael.
Great, thank you very much, and I echo Lisa's points. I guess the main thoughts that I would throw in there. Number one, I think that this election cycle shows that the importance of ensuring not only that elections are conducted legitimately, but that there's an appearance of legitimacy, right? And for those of you who do campaign finance law, you're used to the Supreme Court's distinguishing those two concepts in the area of campaign finance. And I think that this election, as well as the public reaction, at least on the Republican side or part of the Republican side to the election, shows that as we craft policies and as we interpret and perhaps even amend laws governing things like poll watchers, governing things like absentee voting, right? It's important to take into account not just expanding opportunities to vote and ensuring the actual integrity of the process, but also on the back end, ensuring that the process is something that is easily defensible to the public. That's one that doesn't generate unnecessary concern and distrust. And I think that as we go forward, we're going to see things that previously had been left to norms instead be replaced by law, and hopefully clear, specific, determinate law.
Thanks, Michael. So now I'll turn to Derek Muller from Iowa on the law faculty there. Derek.
Steve, and thanks to everyone at Ohio State for hosting these roundtables. I'm looking at January 6th. I look and think a lot about counting of electoral votes, and I'm a big fan of thinking about non-judicial precedent, thinking about how Congress sort of as an institution regulates itself, what it's done in the past, what it does in the past with judging congressional elections and election contests, but also in counting electoral votes in presidential elections. And we've seen some drama in recent years, some long-standing historical drama in the counting of electoral votes and controversies that arise. And so I think there's going to be some kind of kerfuffle on the floor. The question is how much is, sort of a few minutes that's quashed relatively quickly versus things that trail out in debates. What kinds of precedent does Congress establish in terms of the kinds of objections that are raised, if they are sustained, that go on to a debate, how Congress handles those and rules on those determinations and so on. And hopefully will provide some clarity and some solid footing going forward for future electoral counts.
Thanks, Derek. Nate Persley, who's a member of the faculty of both the Political Science Department and the College of Law at Stanford. Nate? Oh, you're still muted.
Let me piggyback on what Michael Morley was talking about, because that is what I'm focusing on these days. And I'll just frame it a little bit differently, which is how do you address the polarization and lack of confidence that well over a third of the population has in the election results? And how do you do so in a way that is not responsive to the worst of the conspiracy theories that are out there, but addresses real reforms that might actually lead to increased confidence across the board? And I think that is an extremely difficult problem to address. There are things that one could do in reforming mail balloting or regulating voting machines or dealing with the vote counting process. But given the sort of panoply of objections and conspiracies that have emerged in the post-election period, it's not clear to me that any legal reform, let alone norms which have already been shattered, but any actual procedural or administrative or legal reform, whether it will have those benefits. Nevertheless, it still might be worth pursuing from the standpoint of good election practices. And so I think in the coming years, I hope that we'll dedicate some energy to that. I also worry that both the incoming administration and Congress will have legitimate reasons to try to put the election behind them, to focus on pressing issues of the day, whether it's COVID and the rest. But we have to have a kind of reckoning with what happened in this election. And I don't want it to just happen at the state level, where you've had red and blue states that are going to start adopting quite polarized and different ways to address voting.
Thanks, Nate. Rick Pildes, law professor at NYU, will be next. Go ahead, Rick.
Yes, so I'm on the same wavelength here as Michael and Nate. We're done with 2020 as far as I'm concerned, but figuring out how we can establish as much legitimacy for the process going forward is a huge challenge. We now realize in a way that I think we haven't before how big a challenge this is going to be. One of the things I'm thinking about is the progress over time in moving away from these hyper decentralized processes we have to greater centralization, either at the state or national level. So you can think of Bush v. Gore is actually establishing a uniform standard that we didn't have before for counting ballots. Congress responded with the Help America Vote Act after 2000. That also established the requirement that voter registration be done at the statewide level. Established a national system of provisional ballots. And so where are the opportunities to move things up to higher levels in the system so that we can get clearer rules that are specified in advance? So one of the things I've been thinking a little bit about is Secretaries of State. One of the things that surprised me, or not surprised me, but that was really driven home in this election is how much of a lack of guidance there is at the central level from the Secretaries of State on a number of important issues. And we saw guidance coming out, the day before the election in some important states on major issues, like do you have an opportunity to cure defects in absentee ballots or things like that. So I don't think there's a centralized place yet to give sort of model guidance to Secretaries of State about what issues, for example, they have to address in advance through guidance documents. Things like that are kind of the direction I'm thinking. How can we move things up to levels that will be more transparent? We'll get a one clear rule, statewide, consistent, hopefully across states if possible. But measures that will bring greater clarity in advance of the election in a consistent way, so that we're not left with individual counties kind of in an ad hoc way as the election nears, crafting policies on the fly.
Thanks, Rick. Charles Stewart from the Political Science faculty at MIT. Charles?
Thanks, Steve. And thanks again to Ohio State and Law School and the elections program for organizing this. And thanks to this assembled multitude for putting up with the lone non-lawyer political scientist who's been in these conversations. Just to add, and just a couple of things that I've been thinking about, which actually some of them come about from my other side of my professional life, which is studying Congress. And so one of the things that I have top of mind right now is just thinking about what to make of the fact that, for instance, most Republicans went along and supported the misguided, put your inserted adjective here, case that the Trump campaign brought before the Supreme Court, what to make of that. And I mean, right off the bat, I mean, just one of the things that's really clear to me is that it does reflect a couple of things just about where the Republican Party is right now and where Congress is right now. We know that, and this is another thing I'm thinking about, is public opinion about this election. We know that Republican voters have turned on a dime with respect to what they think about American elections, in some cases really quite dramatically. And so, we have very conservative, the most conservative Republicans in the House of Representatives reflecting that constituency. And I think that there's going to be just very interesting, there's going to be a very interesting dialectic between those Republican members of the House and their constituents over the next several years. And this goes beyond just simply being worried about being primaried. And this, I think, just goes to the core of what it means to be kind of an active Republican these days. And so this might very well, unfortunately, presage even continued kind of guerrilla action around governance in Washington, D.C. I mean, I think we also have to remember that the Republican caucus itself has played footsie over the last several years with, kind of a palace coup and throwing out speakers and doing all sorts of things. And so kind of, going right up to the line with respect to constitutional governance is sort of not a new thing. But I'm worried that it's going to a different level. So that's one thing at top of mind. The other thing at top of mind is in what, 2 weeks roughly, state legislatures are going to start convening and start legislating. And a couple of people have mentioned that already. One of the things there that I have a slightly different sense about how things are going to shake out there. I mean, certainly Republican legislatures are going to be driven toward hearings that will cast doubt on the legitimacy of the election. They're already doing that. Blue state legislatures are probably going to go forward and try to expand and solidify gains in voting by mail. On the Republican side, I would just note that many of the things that Republican legislatures might want to pull back on, many Republican voters are doing and like to do. And so it may not be as easy as some people imagine for Republican state legislatures to tighten the screws as much as perhaps their rhetoric would suggest. And so, but in any case, I think state legislatures will be really interesting and maybe not even terribly obvious in the next few months.
Thanks, Charles. I'll jump now to the top of the alphabet, which gets us to Guy Charles, who's with us from the law school at Duke University. Guy.
Thank you, and thank you all. So 2 things that I'm thinking about. The first is the role of elections is to proceduralize dispute, to have a mechanism by which we fight it out procedurally and decide that there's a winner, and then to hand over the reins of power to the folks who have won. Not only is there now been, especially on the Republican side, dispute as to who won the election, obviously not supported by any fact, but also the fact that elections are not performing the role, they don't seem to be performing their role in 2020 that democracy expects them to perform. So in a highly polarized, and some have even called it tribalized, and even other political scientists and political psychologists have come up with other terms to talk about the divisions among our society currently. So if elections are not doing the role that they're supposed to perform, and disputes are not settled, and the out party does not believe that the in party holds power illegitimately, then what is the future of democratic governance? What is the future of policy making? Right? So like, where do we go from here? And I think that's, that goes beyond the electoral rules themselves, that go to sort of the core function of what we think democratic governance is supposed to do. And that's one of the major questions that I'm thinking about. The other question that I'm thinking about relates to some of the things that my fellow co-panelists have said, and it deals with the extent to which turnout is going to continue to matter in upcoming elections, and I mean it in the following way. So there's an argument that Republicans have an incentive to change the electoral rules, but it's actually now harder to change electoral rules without undermining your own base and undermining your own turnout. So you're seeing this debate playing out in Georgia. And so the question for me is whether the incentive structures of American democracy going forward will lead toward making it easier for people to participate, and then the incentive structure then is ginning up your base to turn out, as opposed to doing what you can, as much as you can, to minimize the political participation of the other side, because you assume that low turnout is going to benefit you. So I'm really interested in seeing, as we saw in this past election, Republicans in fact did quite well in many places when they made it easier for voters to vote. Yes, they lost the presidential elections, but they did well in many other elections. So I'm interested just to see to what extent are the incentive structures, have they changed? Are they in favor of now a turnout election by making it easier for people to vote, and both sides have that incentive of making it easier to vote and then ginning up their base? Or are we fighting the war of power through the electoral rules? Thank you.
Thank you, Guy. So turn next to Josh Douglas from the law school at the University of Kentucky. Josh.
Thanks, Steve. The first thing on my mind is just how grateful I am for this group and getting to see some of my favorite election law friends from around the country through Ohio State's facilitation. So thank you to you and to Ned and to Jillian for doing that. There's a few substantive issues, and some of it would echo what others have said, but let me try to put a couple fine points on a few things. One, there's the obvious concern about people's faith in the legitimacy of the election. And we're seeing it much more on the Republican side with respect to the presidential election. There's also been conspiracy theories on the left in Kentucky, and people are shocked that Mitch McConnell seems to keep winning, even though his approval rating is at, 18%. There was a Twitter thread that got shared over probably close to 30,000 times now that basically said there's no way he could have lost. And so I think we really need to do a lot of work on both sides, on both kind of fringes, I guess, although, it's been more of the Republican mainstream that has bought into the conspiracy theories this year. So it's a very difficult task, but what do we do about that? A second thing I'm thinking about is how can we take what happened in Kentucky, which was actually somewhat of a success story when it comes to election law, and expand that for future years here in Kentucky, but also nationwide. So we expanded the right to vote in Kentucky more than had ever been before, with early voting for the first time, with a bunch of various other reforms that were passed by the Democratic governor and Republican Secretary of State, so in a bipartisan fashion. And Republicans did better than ever in Kentucky. I mean, I actually think it was perhaps the largest Republican wave at the state legislative level anywhere in the country. And so what can we use, what can we take from the lessons of making it easier to vote in a state that had traditionally been among probably the worst 5 or so in the country? And then third, piggybacking off of, I think, what Guy had just said, with respect to state legislatures and passing new laws, we're about to start a new round of redistricting too. So it's not just voting reform legislation, but don't look away. We just finished some litigation. I mean, the last litigation from the last cycle is basically just ended, and we're about to start it up again. So no rest for the election law weary.
Great, thanks, Josh. I'll turn next to my Ohio State colleague, Ned Foley. Ned?
Well, I'd like to echo what Michael started and a lot of other people chimed in on, that the big picture main concern is some sort of cross-partisan acceptance of the results of our electoral process. And it's going to be a real challenge for the reasons that people I identified. So I hope our field over the next few years can really figure out what seems to me a genuine, so almost psychological crisis in terms of our capacity to understand self-government. But just a couple of quick, more specific things on the voting process itself. Charles mentioned the idea of red state legislatures and blue state legislatures doing different things, just exercising political power. And that's probably to be expected. And perhaps I'm naive and idealistic, but I'd like to think that we could build some sort of reasonable bipartisan common ground, particularly around vote by mail coming out of this year, as difficult as the vote by mail issue has been in terms of polarization. But for example, I think, signature matching should be something of the previous century. It's not a 21st century concept to be trying to match signatures, and maybe we could get some more confidence in vote by mail if we replace signature matching with some sort of unique numerical identifier that voters would get at time of registration. Could be built on their driver's license number or their state ID number, but it would be so much easier to match a number than it would be to try to match signatures. And so I'm sort of interested whether there's any capacity for compromise from the different polarized positions, or whether the both parties are just going to have different visions of the electoral process. Secondly, real quick, I think institutionally, we have to really look at the role of federal courts in this litigation over the presidential election process in the aftermath of Election Day. I don't think it was the design of the Electoral Count Act I've written about this, to have this federal district court litigation over certification of presidential election results. If that's not clear as a matter of federal statutory law, I think we need to clarify that and just figure, where institutionally in government are we supposed to be fighting over these issues? Because if there is disputation, as Guy said, let's figure out the appropriate forum for resolving our disputes. But this year seemed unbelievably chaotic, both before Election Day and since Election Day, such we didn't even know where we were supposed to go to in order to figure out what the rules were. And then finally, picking up on Derek and headed into January 6th, I think there's, fundamental differences of understanding of what the relationship is of the Electoral College vote that occurred this week and the role of Congress in reviewing that vote. There's talk as if somehow Congress is supposed to sit in judgment over whether or not the states correctly tallied their own popular vote in anticipation of appointing electors. My own view is that that's a mistake in terms of, I don't love the Electoral College. People who read my work know that, but it is our system. But understanding our system understands some things that come with the system. And that means the states figure out who their electors are. And then Congress's job is just to figure out who the electors are that the state appointed. Not Congress isn't supposed to retally the popular vote. But that's not the national conversation at the moment right now. And so, I think we definitely will get through January 6th successfully. We'll have some drama maybe like Derek talks about, but we need to have a fundamental understanding of our own system. And we lack that, I think, at this point, unfortunately. Thanks, Steve.
Yep, thanks, Ned. Rebecca Greene from the College of Law, William and Mary.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's really always so interesting to hear from all of you, and thanks to Ohio State for bringing us together. So as has been mentioned, Republican-held legislatures around the country are primed to beef up protections against fraud. And the reaction among Democrats will be to claim that this is being done to restrict voting. In states with Democratic majority legislatures, the name of the game is going to be expanding options to vote. And Republicans are going to argue that Democrats are opening up their elections to fraud and doing so as they already are. And this is a circular firing squad. Some might say that we dodged a bullet in this election. The outcome wasn't close enough and it didn't come down to a single state, but I don't think we did dodge a bullet. I think it was a direct hit because millions upon millions of Americans have lost faith in our system of elections, and perilously so. We have to put a stop to pitting access against integrity. And I think the challenge is to internalize a reality that Rick Hasson and many others, including in this group, have been trying to point out for years, is that American elections cannot function without both access and integrity. And so that means that Democrats who seek to expand voting options have to pay a huge amount of attention to ensuring that there are safeguards against fraud and robust transparency accompanying those reforms. Republicans, for their part, have to internalize that there are enfranchising ways of preventing fraud and there are disenfranchising ways of preventing fraud. And they can avoid a lot of litigation by working together with election officials and other experts to ensure that they pick the former. But I think restoring public confidence in elections has to be the shared goal and singular focus of all sides of the political spectrum if we are going to get through this, because as others have pointed out, we are in a perilous place in terms of our democracy functioning.
Thanks, Rebecca. And so Justin, I'll turn to you. Justin Levitt from Loyola Law School is our last of the group to go today. Go ahead.
And certainly least. So I too want to say thank you to Ned and Steve and the team at Ohio State for pulling this group together and keeping us together and allowing us to all talk to each other and talk to everybody else who's listening over an exceptionally difficult time that we're now looking forward from. I'm also going to invoke a senior election law scholar who's not represented here, Pam Carlin, who would have said if she were in this space, everything's already been said, but not yet by everybody. So that's why I get to talk. I share Nate's desire to help with the next round of mechanics, and also Nate's skepticism that solving the next round of mechanics is actually going to solve any of the deeper problems. The deeper problems, I think, will unfortunately scapegoat new mechanics solutions. And so we're left in a Red Queen's race in trying to fix the problem that seems to be the symptom and not actually the problem. And I don't know how to fix the problem. That's itself a big problem. I'm also focused, like Charles is, on the congressional amicus briefs as an emblem of that problem. I'm not focused on the law of it. I think the law of it is wrong. Others here think the law is closer to right. But even accepting the legal claims there, that amicus brief shows, I think, two really troublesome points. One is a dangerous reliance on the Supreme Court to settle all disputes. This is, to Guy's point, we've got lots of dispute resolution mechanisms and fora. And the notion that nothing's final until the Supreme Court says it's final breaks the system because of the very, 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 very few cases that ever reach the Supreme Court or are decided by the Supreme Court. So we have to come epistemologically to some understanding that we can achieve finality of dispute resolution without having 5 of 9 people in black robes pronouncing it so. Secondly, the second really troublesome aspect of the congressional amicus brief that I think will haunt us going forward, and which I'm really trying to figure out how to embrace, is the tie between conspiracy and marketing of conspiracy. So the amicus brief said the following, quote, "The election of 2020 has been riddled with an unprecedented number of serious allegations of fraud and irregularities. National polls indicate a large percentage of Americans now have serious doubts about not just the outcome of the presidential contest, but also the future reliability of our election system itself." The first sentence, an unprecedented number of serious allegations of fraud and irregularities, is just not true. That's factually wrong. The second sentence, that a large percentage of Americans now have very serious doubts about the whole platform underlying the infrastructure of the system that helps us do things together, is unquestionably true, but also manufactured. And I don't know what to do about that, because the incentive to further manufacture that lack of confidence in the system seems especially troublesome. In 2006, the Missouri Supreme Court said something I thought was very wise. It said we have to acknowledge that the public perception of legitimacy matters, but we cannot let the public perception of legitimacy drive legality, because then the marketing machine, whoever's got the bigger marketing machine, drives legality, and that cannot be the basis for law in this country. The courts, this cycle, followed the Missouri Supreme Court's really sound wisdom. I am very proud of the way the courts have behaved as courts. I don't always agree with all the decisions they made, but I'm very proud of the fact that courts behaved as courts. But a democracy held together by courts is not going to be a democracy for very long. And I don't know how we get the rest of our decision-making structures to follow the same logic in beating back the notion that manufacturing a perception of irregularity helps you actually achieve a different outcome than the one that reality tells you you achieve.
Thanks, Justin. So obviously there is a very strong theme coming from all of you today about things like legitimacy and overall health. And, Rebecca put a very fine point on it in arguing that, in fact, the system did take a direct hit and that the damage has been done. And now we need to figure out how to respond. And the response to that, many of you have suggested, is something that takes more than the work of those of us who are involved in the trenches of election law and the legalities of election administration. There's something more than that out there. In fact, the courts did behave and perform admirably this cycle, and yet we're talking about real sort of existential worries about our system. I wonder if I can invite us to think for a moment, or it'll be a few minutes, I'm sure, about the extent to which what happens on January 6th has the potential to worsen the situation we find ourselves in, or the potential to begin moving in the healing direction we'd like to move. And is there any way to think about that moment in time in terms of this broader question that's helpful today.
Can I add one thing there, that January 5th might be more important than January 6th, even though that we, naturally would pay attention to the impact on the presidential election. But what happens in the Georgia Senate runoff, I think, is going to, it's in some ways the first test case of whether the degradation in confidence is going to both be bipartisan or spin out of control. Many of us have said that there are long-term implications for the casting doubt on the democracy and the election administration system in this election, but it's not so clear what does that actually mean when you have losses of confidence like this. I mean, if you look in struggling democracies, it's possibilities of violence, possibilities of people not ceding power and the like. I think what is going to happen, and Georgia could be a test case for this, is that questioning of the results and the process will become routinized, right? And so that losers will systematically, on both Republicans and Democrats, question the results and the rules that led to them. And so January 5th for me is a critical date because in the event Democrats lose one or both of those seats and question the results, then we will know in some ways what the short-term or medium-term impact of this question of democracy is. With respect to what's happening in Congress, I think that in some ways it can only do more damage I think the upside of them just affirming the result and not doing anything dramatic is not so up, but that there could be additional downside just to provide another forum for people to question the results and to drum up controversy.
Thanks, Nate. Josh, I know you have a thought.
So you all know that I'm generally an optimist, and I try to put a positive spin on things. So here's my attempt to put a positive spin on what happened this past Monday and what will happen on January 6th, is that a lot more people are paying attention to the process. And so perhaps we could use this moment as a way to have renewed civics education about how our democracy actually functions. There are tons of people who reached out to me who after I put out, something on Twitter about what was happening on December 14th, who said, I never even thought about kind of who the electors were and what the process was for what they have to do. And similarly on January 6th, there's a sort of routine process that should take place under the Electoral Count Act, and I expect it to take place, whether there's an objection or not from a senator to join at least one member of the House, which I think is plausible and maybe even likely. But at least there's going to be more attention to the process. So I don't think that's a good thing if the process is breaking down on January 6th, but perhaps we can put a positive spin on it and say, okay, one of the solutions, and this is not a perfect solution because you need to be able to reach the fringes of the ideological spectrum to get them to buy into and understand the way our democracy works. But at least there's greater scrutiny of it, and that perhaps can lead to a renewed push for stronger civics education about how our institutions are supposed to operate.
Does anyone want to tackle the question in the question box about whether Vice President Pence might go rogue on January 6th?
Well, I feel pretty optimistic he won't. I mean, others can think otherwise. Vice President Pence, he did not join President Trump's motion to intervene in Texas versus Pennsylvania before the Supreme Court. Vice President Pence has not joined President Trump in the Wisconsin federal election litigation in the district court. He's been quite silent over the last several weeks, and institutionally, I think he's thinking about a 2024 run or something beyond that. So there's a sense in my mind, at least, that I view that as an unlikely scenario. I mean, there's always something else that could happen, I suppose. But my sense is he's going to preserve order in the chamber and let sort of the events play out in Congress. But one can only guess.
And he's doing the vice presidential version of going to Disney World by, I guess, getting on a plane and going overseas right after the ceremony. So he has a plane to catch. So I take that as a good sign.
Yeah, I mean, I think to back on Charles, I mean, I think there's some chance perhaps that plane leaves before January 6th and that the president pro tem of the Senate might have to exercise that that responsibility. I don't know that to be true, but at least, one has to contemplate that. To Derek's point, or to the question, there's the vice president or the Senate president doesn't have to go rogue for there to be some complicated questions that are still on the table about how the situation unfolds. I think the answer of, who's going to be declared president-elect is obvious. It's going to be Biden at the end of January 6th meeting. But to Josh's point, I don't think this year we're just facing the question of whether or not a senator joins a House member's objection. I think if the news reports are accurate, we're going to see a version of this rival slate scenario. It's not going to make a difference in the outcome, but it's going to force the process to create some precedents about how you handle rival submissions. I think there were these meetings on Monday. There were not official meetings that had no backing in state law, that clearly are not valid. They will end up being rejected on January 6th. But just the procedural methodology of how that gets how they get rejected is not straightforward. And it'll be interesting to see that unfold.
There are a number of ways in which people like ourselves who study and think about election law and administration, as well as politicians on all sides, are going to want to adjust what happens going forward with some competing pressures, as we've talked about already, and things that might still happen on January 6th themselves could give rise to additional reasons to think about reforms, including potentially reforming the almost incomprehensible Electoral Count Act that Ned and others have referred to and written about in the past. And there are several of the questions that are in the Q&A feature on our Zoom webinar today that are asking sort of fine points about some of those potential reforms. And then there are other questions there that are much broader, that have to do with the kinds of things that really require more than fine tuning of an existing statute, that are more about underlying values and norms. And it raises to me what is a pretty difficult question, which is, and there's a question in our question room about how we should go about restoring confidence among the proportion of the electorate that's not confident in this election. And that is, how do you do that if some subset of the electorate wants to disbelieve the outcome?
So, well, I want others to speak, but tentatively, I've been thinking that there has to be this iterative process between leadership and the base, or the electorate, right? And so I think the way in which the leadership of the Republican Party has acted over the last month has affected the public opinion data, if we can believe it, on the degree of which voters within the Republican Party have bought in to the narrative that, as Justin said, is just not correct. So, had this last month unfolded differently, would we be in a different place? I mean, I thought that former President George Bush, the day after the media called the race for Biden, issued a statement that was I thought, perfect in tone. It was congratulatory. It referred to Biden as president-elect. At the same time, it acknowledged that the legal process wasn't complete, and that President Trump had a right to recounts and to utilize the legal process if he thought there were claims that were worthy of bringing. And I don't have that in front of me, but then President Bush said he had every reason to expect that the outcome of that legal process would confirm the media's projections, and that America could be confident that the result was free and fair and with integrity. I mean, it sort of hit every note in a perfect way. You know, I think if we're candid about this, the very next day, the Monday after the media announced, Senator McConnell issued a very different statement in tone than President Bush's statement. It was accurate insofar as it's true that the media has no governmental or official role, and it emphasized the right of the president to pursue recounts and litigation. And to Senator McConnell's credit, he never has echoed or endorsed, you know, the Trump campaign's false narrative. He simply has been, you know, sort of in a neutral position with regard to that, said the, you know, the process would go forward. I also think it's important to note that, you know, had he not given, Senator McConnell had not given his statement this week and instead acted like Senator Hawley, who, you know, on TV this week said, well, we're waiting until January 6th to figure things out, we'd be in a very different position today. Senator McConnell's statement was really significant, but it would have been different if he had acted like President Bush a month ago. So there is an important dynamic between political leadership and the base of the party. And I think there's more work to be done on that. I mean, I think, you know, whether it's Vice President Pence or others in the party, there's a lot of repair work to Rebecca's point, and I want to hear from others. There's a lot of repair work that needs to be done. Some of it's going to have to come from leadership, I think.
Charles?
Well, you know, I'm usually the most optimistic person in a crowd like this, but I think actually my answer to this sort of question is in some ways ultimately pessimistic in the following sense, that from what I can tell in the United States, at least, there's very little that can be done on the kind of formal election administrative side to instill confidence. And so the first thing I think I would say is, however, there are certainly things that can be done that can undermine confidence. And so maybe there's this Hippocratic principle of first do no harm. I mean, thing number one. And then thing number two, that what I've taken away from my research into kind of voter confidence, regime confidence around election administration, is that there's actually a license among people, legislators, election officials, and the rest for doing the right thing. Understanding that the right thing in the short term sometimes even will further undermine confidence, but can serve certain functions. For instance, making it less likely that certain types of disputes will end up in the courts or will occur at all, or you know, can metastasize. And so it strikes me that if I were advising a state legislature, I don't know that I would necessarily approach it about how to change the laws, or even Congress about what to do to increase voter confidence, but to suggest, first of all, there are things that could make things worse, and don't do those things. And then secondly, think about the things that objectively would bring greater closure to elections, and greater visibility and greater visibility to the electoral process. So don't hide things out. You know, put webcams everywhere and have audits everywhere, and just do the things to convince people who will be convinced that the election was fair and transparent. And there are other things in civil society that need to be worked on to deal with overall kind of system distrust. And so I guess the final thing I would say is, I mean, I think a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the distrust is not so much about the election systems per se, but it's that a deep disbelief that the other side is even legislating at all and is legitimate to legislate at all. And so I don't know that the mechanics of the election itself are really the things that's going to kind of cure this deep distrust in lawmaking and governing in the country. It's not just about elections. We should just do the right thing.
Thanks, Charles. Rick?
Yeah, you know, I do agree that these problems are very deep in the culture right now, and people are dying in hospitals still saying that the virus is not real. I'm sorry, I don't even know where that phone is of mine that's ringing. It's in my pocket. I apologize. I didn't know I had the phone even with me. Sorry. And so this is a huge problem the country faces, and it's not just the United States. This is going on in most of the Western democracies, and social media is a huge driver of all of this. But we still have to shore up what we can in the election process. This is sort of where Nate started, that it may not do a lot of good, but we still have to do the kind of good we can. You know, one of the things to keep in mind about this election is we had rules changing constantly in this election. We had massive litigation, more litigation than we've ever had in advance of the election, not just after the election. Now, a lot of this was a fact of was driven by the pandemic and trying to figure out how to adapt the system appropriately to the pandemic. But the more the rules are changing along the way as we get close to the election, the more, in a culture that is so vulnerable, people are going to start getting suspicious. And so I think we've got to figure out how to bring stability to the legal framework for elections. That's part of why I say, you know, helping election administrators in this insanely decentralized process we have develop clear enough policies and rules in advance and well in advance of the election, so that we're not 2 months, 3 months before the election fighting about this rule or that rule, let alone after the election. I think the absentee ballot issue is going to be just a constant sore spot in the midst of the kind of polarization that we have. And I think it's going to be on the left as well as the right. So, you know, one of the things we worried about in the election going in didn't happen this time, but it may happen in 2022, which is there are going to be rejection rates of absentee ballots that may become significant again. There may be postal service delays in getting ballots back. There may be a variety of other problems with absentee ballots that people on the left are going to be upset about because they're going to feel votes are being inappropriately rejected. And I think that, you know, this is my view for this election, but I think it's my view going forward. I'm in favor of convenience voting, making it easier for people to vote, but I much prefer expanded access to early voting than I do absentee voting. I mean, I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with absentee voting at all. But I think in our culture, we have to realize that this is a place of great vulnerability for both sides. And in close elections, if a high percentage of votes are by absentee ballots, that's going to be the focal point of the fights, I believe. Just as it was this year, I believe that will be true going forward. So I know many people hope we have expanded absentee voting going forward. But my view is one of the places we can shore the system up is through encouraging people to vote in person, but give them lots of opportunities to do that through expanded early voting. I'm in favor of making Election Day a holiday, anything that expands access, but focused on in-person participation. I think it reduces some of the points of greatest vulnerability to the suspicions that exist on both sides and are going to continue to exist on both sides in the culture that we're in.
Thanks, Rick.
Can I add one thing there, which is just that I think one of the big questions for which we will have an answer in the next 8 months is how many of the emergency moves that were made for this election are going to stick. And so I suspect, you know, there were states that were on a trajectory toward greater mail balloting, which the pandemic then accelerated their move along that trajectory, California being most notable on that. Then there are and then the states that moved to no excuse absentee balloting, some of which did it before the pandemic hit. I don't think it's going to be hard to reverse a change like that. Where I do think you'll see some changes, though, is on things like signature verification and other security measures, where then you may see in states where you have unified control, and that's an important caveat, that you may see some additional security measures being put on the back end that will make it more difficult to deal with mail balloting and the like. One thing, and this echoes what Charles said before, is that it is in many of the states which made significant changes, particularly the Midwestern states that we focus on. It's not so easy. I mean, these have Democratic governors, right? There's shared control. They're not going to be able to roll back or to enact new measures that easily. But there are other places, perhaps Florida, perhaps Arizona, some others, where they might be able to enact, and Georgia, of course, new measures.
So we're getting close to 5 Eastern time. I know we'll lose some of you at the top of the hour, but those of you who want to continue talking for a few more minutes, we've still got plenty of things we could wrestle with a bit longer. Guy, I think you were thinking of a response a minute ago on one of these points.
Sure. If I can build on and broaden a point that Rick Pildes made, which is related to the point of signature matching and verification that Nate made, which is thinking through rules that can be clear and help resolve disputes, or won't lead to disputes, that are easily for voters to exercise and for administrators to implement. Right. So, for example, getting rid of some of the signature matching requirements to the extent that there's agreement on some of those. But what are the types of things that will not trip the voter up, that don't require discretion, that will not lead to litigation, I think are extremely important, as well as rules in which there can be bipartisan agreement, if that is even possible. And then one last point on role morality. One of the things that's very interesting in this context is the way that some of the secretaries of state, regardless of party, the judges, regardless of party, have performed, right? And that's partly a function of role morality. Their understanding of themselves as judges, or their understanding of themselves as administrators with a responsibility. So to support some of the points that have been made about doing no harm, we can also shore up some of those norms. So that way people who are in those functions understand themselves as implementers of neutral rules, as opposed to performing a particular partisan function. And whatever we can do to support that ought to be done.
So I'm going to turn to Justin next, but I will also say there are a couple of questions that are inviting us to make clear why this election and the response to it feels different than 2016, that I think it might be worth talking about for a few minutes for our own sake, as well as for the audience's sake, but we'll hold that. Justin, go ahead.
Well, so this may actually, I don't know if this provides a bridge to that conversation you're looking to have, Steve, or not. But following up on Guy's last really important point, I think there's broad bilateral bipartisan consensus that election officials really performed extraordinarily admirably, particularly considering all of the crazy conditions they had to go through in order to run this election, and holding up those nonpartisan ideals that he mentioned, the living up to their role responsibilities, that they really did exceptionally well. But they came under some extraordinary pressure in this cycle, uniquely to this cycle. Economic pressure in trying to run elections with budgets they did not have, political pressure in trying to overturn results that they themselves knew to be fair, and even outside violent protests that had some election officials receiving death threats in the course of the election. And I think it's going to be really imperative as we look to the future to not just shore up the role morality and to bolster, support those who really did an exceptional job this time around, but to make sure that the path to becoming an election official is at least as open as it is now, and more open to people who want to serve in that capacity. I am very concerned that what we saw this election will mean that we have fewer talented election officials to draw on, because who would want to sign up for that right now? And so not only moral support for the role morality, but real financial and political and even security support for those who engage in protecting our election structure has got to be, I mean, this may fall under the process of both a mechanical fix and something to begin to address some of the underlying very sort of psychological difficulties this election has revealed. But that's got to be a next step for the future across the board in every state.
Great. Thanks, Justin.
Well, I'll say something about the broader question about why this year was different. I think I may have said a version of this in the previous discussion, but real quick, I mean, obviously the pandemic put unique administrative stresses on our ability to run the election. But as Rick Pildes said in the previous call, you know, we would be celebrating this amazing administrative feat in the way Justin is saying now, if we only focused on the fact that we conquered the pandemic from an election administration perspective in the general election, where we had real reasons in the primary to be really worried based on the Georgia primary and the Wisconsin primary. I mean, think of all the things that we were so worried about most of the year. And yet, as Rick said, we should be celebrating. But the other unique feature of this year, and for me has felt like the more difficult feature, is, you know, an incumbent president was running for re-election who had been impeached for trying to interfere with the electoral process. He was acquitted on that impeachment. That's understandable, but you know, I think if we have to acknowledge the role that Trump has played in being subversive of our system. And, you know, and I've called it an electoral version of McCarthyism, because I think the kind of paranoia and the denial of reality and the demagoguery and the phenomenon that we've been going through is an application to the electoral system of the pathology of McCarthyism and the Red Scare that applied to a different aspect of governance. But in my study of history, we've never had what Richard Hofstadter called the paranoid style of American politics applied to counting ballots. And that's a uniquely difficult and dangerous circumstance. And so, you know, McCarthyism ended when, you know, Joe McCarthy left the scene and his, you know, bubble burst when "Have you no decency, sir?" or at the Army hearings. You know, Gabriel Sterling in effect tried to burst this version of it with his, you know, I think everybody of our panel in the audience knows this was the Georgia election official who said, "This has got to stop. This has got to stop." You know, Chris Krebs, I think, said a version of that in the Senate hearings yesterday. And, you know, some people have stepped up in the aftermath of that, but not everybody has. And until we figure out a way to end, you know, this version of what I call electoral McCarthyism, we're going to be in the grips of it. I mean, McCarthyism lasted for 4 years. You know, the "I have a list of communists" speech was in 1950, and the Army hearings wasn't until 1954. And when I watched the press conference in which Rudy Giuliani said, "I've got this evidence of fraud," it was like, "I've got this list of communists." It was never produced in court because it, you know, it didn't exist. But it was believed by millions of people in the same way McCarthy was believed, because there was this dynamic relationship between a charismatic leader and followers that others in leadership were not willing to resist. You know, Senator Taft, who was the majority leader or the Republican leader in the Senate, you know, didn't like McCarthyism, but he, you know, he couldn't fight it. President Eisenhower didn't like it, couldn't really resist it. So, you know, I think we have to understand the moment that we're in order to meet the challenge of it. And you know, it's a loaded term, McCarthyism, but I think it's apt, unfortunately.
Ned, I have a question I want to ask just very briefly in response to that. This will probably take us too far afield, but I have to ask it quickly here. If we had the modern presidential primaries process in the 1950s, do you think McCarthy would have ended up as the nominee, potentially, of the Republican Party for president?
You know, I don't know. I haven't gone back and read the novels by, what was it, Sinclair Lewis. It can happen here, or it can't happen here, or what have you. which was, during the rise of fascism in the 1930s, there was this genuine fear of whether America could be taken over by something like that, including a presidential candidate, I think. But since I haven't read the novel, I hope I don't misrepresent it. So I think we need a we need to look to not just our expertise as election law, but political science, social science, political psychology, I think, to meet the moment. So I guess I turn that back to you. Do you think we could ever get a presidential candidate who was McCarthy-esque?
Yes, I absolutely think we could. I think that, well, I don't want to get too far into my own little kind of pet, story here, but I think once we eliminated all the gatekeeping mechanisms for the nominees of the major parties, eliminated the role of party figures having some significant say from around the country and who should be the party's nominee, we absolutely opened up the possibility of populist demagogues who are going to be very effective in the primaries, capturing the party nomination. And we've already learned from recent cycles that they don't even have to be strongly tied to the party whose nomination they managed to capture by being the most effective candidate in the primaries under the label of one of the two major parties. So I think that has made it more likely that we have exposed ourselves to greater variation and greater risk in the kinds of people who will be major party nominees.
I'll just quickly jump in to identify the elephant in the room. I mean, a person who fit that description just lost the 2020 election. So there's some, I think for those who are committed to the rule of law, there's a great victory in that, as well as getting an election through a pandemic. That's been a separate, obviously, very difficult thing that the system has been grappling with right now.
Can I echo something here, which is that everyone assumes that President Trump, once he leaves office, will continue to hold important sway over the Republican Party. And I think the jury is really out on that. And I think that people underestimate the ambitiousness of individual politicians on the Republican side, as well as what might happen in the midterms and the like. And so it may be that Trumpism outlasts Trump, and that there has been this almost mortal wound caused by this election in terms of confidence in the democracy. But he is a unique historical figure, and it's not clear to me that other existing figures on the horizon can actually mimic his talents and capabilities. And so it still may be the case that, as I think we all agree, that we're going to be reckoning with this loss of confidence in the system. But the capabilities of different politicians may prove that we're not going to have a replay of particularly what we saw in this election, and for that matter in 2016, and that it'll be much more complicated for another figure to achieve the same damage.
Well, we probably should go ahead and wrap up. I mean, there are a number of other questions and comments in the Q&A, and many of them are in fact comments that are interesting or provocative in their own way. And there's some good questions there that we haven't had a chance to get to, or questions that are really sort of extending into different directions or fields about redistricting, for instance, that would be fun for us to talk about, but it's not what we've really prepared to be discussing today. I do wonder if, before we conclude, somebody would like to just take on the question of, back to January 6th, is there any role for, and we know the answer to this question, but for the benefit of people who are watching, any role for the courts in supervising what happens on January 6th? And what if on January 20th, there is still some group of members of Congress and President Trump who are refusing to acknowledge? And Derek, is that something you'd want to just quickly address for our audience?
I mean, I get too many dystopian tales, right? I mean, I really love Congress handling a lot of these disputes, as much as I might not love what Congress does with them at times. But, you know, the courts, sort of their moment has passed. The certifications have happened, the election contests have happened, the certificates of ascertainment and the votes of electors are being sent to the archives. And on January 6th, we're going to count them, and there's going to be a president on January 20th. And you know, we can sort of maybe dream up hypothetical scenarios about all the unusual recalcitrants, but the system is going to move on. I mean, Congress is going to start confirming cabinet positions for President-elect Biden. I mean, things are going to move down the track, and so it's mostly, you know, I think some of the framing at the beginning from Lisa and others thinking about 2022 or thinking about the things beyond. What does legislation look like? Are there going to be bipartisan commissions handling these things? You know, that's what we're really thinking about. And you know, the courts are going to be, I think, you know, falling into a smaller and smaller role with each passing day ahead of January 20th, at least for this election.
Thanks, Derek. I do think you're absolutely right that the way in which each of us began this conversation itself is a confirmation that the 2020 election itself is over. And despite whatever fireworks some people may want to set off on January 6th, they will be just fireworks, but there's nothing left to happen and no court roll and so forth. I'm sorry to be the one to bring this to a close at this point, but it's great to have had all of you here, and thanks to those of you who were able to stay a little past the top of the hour for sticking around with us. And many thanks to Jillian for helping organize this, and to all the audience who chose to participate and to include questions for us to respond to and riff off of. So we wish everyone a calm rest of this month, and hope that you can enjoy some downtime, family time, holiday time, and thinking about some other things from time to time anyway, even as we all remain engaged in the serious reflection of figuring out how to make our democratic processes healthier. Thanks for being with us.
And let me just add my thanks to Steve and to all of you. Steve has done a fantastic job moderating today and all of our sessions. So, you know, I owe him a debt of gratitude, as I think we all do. And, you know, on the effort to be optimistic, the theme that some of you have made, I'm struck by the notion that at least incremental progress is some progress, right? And we don't have to have perfection be the enemy of the good. So if over the next 2 or 4 years, we improve the system, that's worthwhile. So with that, hopefully better note, again, happy holidays to everybody, and thanks for today.